have just passed the second anniversary of the liberation of Bucha, where the world was forced to witness the results of Russian occupation, which were, of course, the slaughter of up to 1,500 Ukrainians in Bucha and in the surrounding areas, in scenes that were shocking for their depravity. But I personally, and many people think agree with me, were not shocking for those who have witnessed Russian military actions in the past. Individuals bound by feet and hands, shot in the back of the head, and either left in mass graves or left in ditches. Stories of horrific sexual violence against civilians, men, women, and children, should be said. Torture, both nominally for intelligence purposes, and brutal interrogations, but also seemingly torture for sadistic enjoyment of the occupying forces. It's a truly nasty subject to talk about, but it's not just a side effect of the Russian way of war. This is not, as some might say, what happens when like an ill-disciplined army is conducting a war effort. This is systemic. This is part of the Russian occupation and war plan, if you will. And that's why it needs greater attention, because it's not a humanitarian issue. This is part of the core security issue in discussing why we're supporting the Ukrainians and why we need to be concerned about Russian aggression elsewhere. Is the Russian way of war is especially destructive to civilian infrastructure and civilian lives, and thus it threatens like a core tenet of the Western alliance, which is the protection of our civilians. Often the assumption I find, it's often assumed that this sort of behavior is a lapse in judgment and a lapse of oversight, which is understandable if people are still reflecting on the if we will, the incompetence that is still some people's minds about the Russian invasion from the initial weeks, like the failed attempt to take Kyiv, and just Russian defeats early in the war, Russian defeats later in 2022. The Russian brutality that we've seen from the Russian military is not simply a result of ill-trained soldiers. Like I said, it has, besides the many ways that this excessive use of force, both on their areas they're targeting, the cities they bombarded to rubble, the cities they're currently trying to bombard into rubble and bomb into rubble, but also the massacre of civilians in cities like Bucha. And frankly, the issue is it becomes something to list. Bucha, I think, has become a symbol of it. But the thing you often hear from Ukrainians in the East, soldiers, civilians, or people in Ukraine witnessing, as journalists or humanitarian activists, say that Bucha is just the beginning of it. I'll cite that the documentary that is, thankfully won an Oscar, 20 Days in Mariupol. Mariupol shows a greater extent of what the Russian way of war looks like. But what's important to see is, beyond just the fact that it seems that it's so commonplace that suggests sort of a systemic problem, what's most fascinating about it is how the Russian high command and Russian government has treated the commanders and the units that have been accused by the Ukrainians and accused by Western analysts and Western leaders of committing these war crimes. Typically what should happen if, say, an American unit or a NATO unit committed some sort of atrocity, which unfortunately we know this has happened in Iraq, Afghanistan. I'm not going to excuse this as just something that happens in war because it's unexcusable. But in the grand scheme of things, it is essentially something that does happen in war. There will be soldiers who conduct themselves in a disgraceful manner, leading to harm to civilians that should not happen. But the way that's supposed to be approached, the way that has been, there's been a number of high-profile, at least in the United States, war crimes trials. There's been several in Australia, also regarding conduct in Iraq and Afghanistan. The soldiers responsible, and often their commanders, are supposed to be tried and court-martialed as befitting their violation of international law and the corresponding laws they violated in either normally not in the U.S., the laws violated in the country of occupation. We don't let guys be tried in Iraq or Afghanistan, obviously. But tried at least in the U.S. by the Uniform Code of Military Justice and be punished for this. I'm not saying that this always happens that way. When discussing with the Russians, is not only are these men not punished, there's solid documentation that this is celebrated, and the officers who lead these activities, order these activities, are being promoted. This is a path to success in the Russian military. If not for the brutality itself, it's when this brutality leads to successful military operations. Doesn't matter the cost, doesn't matter the violations of international law. They're earning promotions. I'm going to quote my very good friend George Barrows, who's at the Institute for the Study of War. I'm sure many of your viewers and listeners are familiar with the Institute for the Study of War. They do phenomenal work. But when I was discussing this with him, he was in short order actually very impressed. I can pull them all up if we need. He just listed me a handful of units that, through open source intelligence, he was coordinating. He and the ISW was coordinating the New York Times, especially on the Butcha investigation, to identify Russian units that were likely responsible. And he essentially he was able to list the units and officers who received citations or rewards for taking part in these activities. And again, I'm not saying that these units had been explicitly rewarded by the Russian high command, Russian government, or by Putin himself for these atrocities, but for their operation. They were celebrated for their operational success that involved these tragedies. And again, the best example, and forgive me, I always struggle with Russian names, Mikhail Mizvintsev, who was commanding the 155th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 8th Combined Army. My understanding is sort of viewed as the commander, if not one of the commanders, for what I would call the raising of Mariupol. It is no different than a medieval siege that saw like the destruction and sack of the city, or or destructions of cities that we saw in grand scale in the Second World War. The way that the Russians took Mariupol, I think from a bird's eye view, clearly violated what anyone in the Western world would consider the normal standard of war. The relentless shelling and bombing of civilian targets, a brutal siege of the city. There were reports of attacks on civilian evacuation columns, repeated attacks too. Nothing that could, with a recurrence that it would be hard to dismiss as accidental. Mizvintsev, he has since received commendation and promotion. A number of other, including as low as platoon commanders who have been involved in operations that involved atrocities, mass killings, if it's done by, say, infantry in armored columns, or air operations that saw the bombing of schools and hospitals. You're seeing these down to junior officers, like platoon commanders, are receiving citations and unit citations, congratulatory citations, and promotions from the Russian high command, and in a few instances celebrated at the Kremlin with military decorations. And obviously these are the extreme end of ill response by the Russian government to its military committing crimes. But the Russian effort to cover up these war crimes has been interesting. And of course, it'd be remiss not to point out that today is the anniversary. It is the commemoration day for the Katyń Forest massacre, where the Soviet Army, where the Red Army massacred the 20,000 Polish officers and members of Polish intelligentsia. And of course, after this discovery by the German army during Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet government, in order to maintain its alliance with the U.S. and Great Britain, conducted a great disinformation effort to, in fact, blame the German army. And obviously, at the time, it was fairly easy to do. People knew about the crimes being committed by the Third Reich and the German army, but it took far too long for the Western world to recognize the Katyń Forest as a Soviet atrocity. So we shouldn't be surprised by the efforts the Russians have put into diffusing blame for this. A very common thing is, of course, for them in the midst of this entire baloney, to use polite language, about denazification of Ukraine. You've had people on to speak about the inanity and the insanity of that claim. But they've, of course, blamed Ukrainian Nazis for the Bucha massacre, said it didn't happen. All things that are predictable in a world where people, and I'm sure you can find a number of senior Russian propagandists who are Holocaust deniers or deniers of other atrocities in the past. It shouldn't surprise us that they're eager to deny that. But they've taken the Russian government, Russian military has taken some real steps to cover for these massacres. One example, and again, I'm going to cite my friend Mr. Barros at ISW. The Russians, at least following the Bucha massacre, seemed pretty content to dispose of their own witnesses, not in imprisonment or even summary execution of these men, but to sort of waste their lives on the front. I believe it was the 76 Airborne Guard was one of the units present at Bucha. Their culpability for the massacre, my understanding, is not entirely known. Like how much of it they conducted, how much of it was happening under their watch. I'm happy to put guilt by association. Even if just guilt by witnessing, the Nuremberg standard applies here. But the Russians were fairly content to, I believe it was later in 2022, in the defense of Kharkiv. Someone might correct me on this. I'm not sure of the details. The Russians were happy to let them be wasted in a doomed counter-offensive operation where they were slaughtered to a man. The 76, if I recall, still exists on paper as a unit, and it might be reconstituted of whole new men, but it was essentially deployed in such a way that guaranteed its destruction in the face of the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. Again, I think near Kharkiv, but I should have double-checked that. And the reason for this seems pretty clear to me. They were not eager to bring these guys back home and punish them themselves. Why would they? They seemingly don't punish men for these operations. But they didn't want to risk this unit being captured and having a lot of Russian witnesses to confess to these crimes, either in Ukrainian court or an international tribunal. So instead, they let them more or less be, fight and die to the last. No witnesses to tell the tale when the Ukrainians captured them.